August 15, 1945. Fort Campbell, Tennessee. The war in Europe had ended 3 months earlier, but for the 37 German women who stepped off the transport truck that sweltering afternoon, surrender felt like it was just beginning. Emilie Vogt clutched the edges of her torn gray auxiliary uniform as American guards motioned them forward with rifles. She had expected this moment to come with violence, with revenge, with the kind of brutality that propaganda had promised would await any German soldier who fell into enemy hands. Instead, what greeted them was something far more unsettling than hatred. It was order. It was calm. And most disturbing of all, it was the smell of something sweet drifting from a nearby building. The women formed a ragged line in the compound's central yard. Their faces carried the hollow look of genuine starvation, cheekbones sharp as broken glass beneath skin that seemed stretched too thin over bone. Britta Schroeder stood beside Emilie, her body swaying slightly in the oppressive heat. She had survived on nothing but weak potato soup and stale bread for the past 4 months. The richness of whatever was baking in that distant kitchen made her stomach clench with a pain that felt almost violent. Captain Richard Thornton emerged from the administration building, his uniform crisp despite the humidity. He was 41 years old, a man whose face carried the weight of command and something deeper, something that looked like grief worn into permanent lines around his eyes. He surveyed the prisoners before him with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy but wasn't cruelty either. Lieutenant Catherine Reynolds stood at his side, clipboard in hand, her practical brown hair pulled back in a tight bun that suggested efficiency over vanity. "Welcome to Fort Campbell," Captain Thornton said, in clear, measured English that only a few of the women could understand. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be fed, housed, and given medical attention." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "You are prisoners of war, but you are also human beings. We will treat you as such." Charlotte Bauer, the oldest among them at 28, translated his words into German for those who couldn't follow. But even as she spoke, doubt flickered across her weathered face. Human beings. The phrase sounded like a trick, like one of those promises that would be snatched away the moment they allowed themselves to believe it. The smell from the kitchen grew stronger as the afternoon sun reached its peak. It was a scent none of them could identify, something that combined sweetness with warmth, fruit with pastry, comfort with a kind of abundance they had forgotten existed in the world. Young Anneliese Mueller, just 19 years old, began to tremble. The aroma reminded her of something from before the war, from a childhood that felt like it had belonged to someone else entirely. The Trapton-W journey to America had taken 17 days across an Atlantic Ocean that seemed to mirror the emptiness in their bellies. Emilie remembered every hour of that voyage, the way the ship's engine hummed beneath the deck where they were kept, the taste of salt air mixed with the metallic tang of fear. But the voyage had only been the final chapter of a much longer story of hunger, one that had been written across their bodies over months and years of deprivation. In the final winter of the war, Germany had been a country eating itself alive. Emilie had worked in a Wehrmacht administrative office in Munich, processing supply requisitions that grew more desperate with each passing week. The official ration cards promised bread, but the bread was mixed with sawdust and chalk. They promised meat, but the meat never came. By February of 1945, she had been living on 400 calories a day, watching her own hands grow thin enough that she could see the delicate architecture of bones beneath skin that had lost its elasticity. Britta's memories of Berlin were even darker. She had served as a radio operator in a bunker that shook with each Allied bomb that fell above them. The operators worked 12-hour shifts, subsisting on weaker Sats coffee made from roasted acorns and occasional slices of black bread that tasted like despair. She remembered the day when Greta, one of her fellow operators, had simply collapsed at her station, her body finally surrendering to months of systematic starvation. They had carried Greta away, and someone else had taken her place at the radio without a word. There was no time for grief when you were too hungry to feel anything but the constant gnawing in your stomach. For young Anneliese, the nurse's aide from Dresden, Hunger had come with a side of horror she could never unsee. She had been working in a makeshift hospital when the firebombing began on February 13th. The hospital had been overwhelmed with burned and broken bodies, and the medical supplies had run out within hours. But worse than the lack of morphine or bandages was the lack of food for the patients. She had watched people die not from their wounds, but from bodies too weakened by starvation to heal. In the chaos that followed the bombing, she had eaten nothing but a single potato for 3 days, and she had considered herself fortunate. Charlotte Bauer, the supply officer, carried the guilt of watching rations diminish while being unable to do anything about it. She had been the one signing off on shipments that never arrived, promising soldiers food that existed only on paper. By April, the entire supply system had collapsed into fiction. She remembered the faces of young soldiers, boys really, who looked at her with hollow eyes and asked when the next meal would come. She had stopped being able to answer them honestly. Elisabeth Koenig had spent her final weeks in Germany and Hamburg, a city that had been bombed so many times it resembled the surface of the moon. She had lived in a basement with 7 other women, sharing whatever scraps they could find. A handful of dried peas, a crust of moldy bread. Once, memorably, a can of condensed milk that someone had looted from a destroyed British supply depot. Corporal Della Mae Washington stood in the camp kitchen at Fort Campbell, her dark hands dusted with flour, her mind focused on the arithmetic of feeding people who had forgotten what it meant to be fed properly. At 32 years old, she had spent the last 3 years of the war cooking for soldiers, prisoners, and anyone else the Army decided needed her particular skills. But this assignment was different. These weren't American boys heading off to battle or coming home from it. These were the enemy, women who had served the regime that had plunged the world into darkness. She rolled out pastry dough with practiced efficiency, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. "Baby girl," her grandmother used to say, "ain't nothing in this world that can't be made a little better with something sweet." Her grandmother had been born into slavery in Georgia, had lived through Reconstruction and Jim Crow, had raised 7 children on a sharecropper's wages. And through it all, she had made peach cobbler every Sunday without fail, transforming whatever hardship the week had brought into something that tasted like grace. Della Mae had learned that recipe at her grandmother's elbow, memorizing the proportions not with measuring cups, but with feel. "You know the dough is right when it feels like a baby's cheek," her grandmother had taught her. "You know the peaches are ready when they smell like summer," remembering itself. The recipe had been passed down through 3 generations of women who understood that sometimes the most revolutionary act was refusing to let bitterness consume you. But standing in this military kitchen, preparing dessert for German prisoners, Della Mae felt the weight of complication pressing down on her shoulders. Her younger brother, Samuel, had died at Normandy. He had been 23 years old, full of dreams about what he would do after the war, after he came home to a country that barely acknowledged his humanity. He had died fighting against the very women she was now being ordered to feed with kindness and abundance. Lieutenant Catherine Reynolds entered the kitchen, her practical shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. "The prisoners are being processed now," she said quietly. "Captain Thornton wants them fed within the hour. He thinks a good meal might help with the transition." She paused, watching Della Mae work. "How are you feeling about all this?" Della Mae didn't look up from her work, her hands continuing their familiar rhythm of cutting butter into flour. "I'm feeling like I got orders, ma'am," she replied evenly. "And I follow orders." But her jaw was tight, and Lieutenant Reynolds was perceptive enough to recognize the restraint in that answer. The truth was more complicated than Della Mae could easily express. She had grown up in the South, had lived her entire life in a country that treated her as less than human because of the color of her skin. She had served in a segregated army, cooking in kitchens where she wasn't allowed to eat alongside the white soldiers she fed. And now she was being asked to show compassion to women who had served a regime that considered her inferior. The dining hall at Fort Campbell had been hastily prepared for its unusual occupants. Long wooden tables stretched across the room, their surfaces scrubbed clean and set with simple white plates and basic utensils. The 37 German women filed in slowly, their movements cautious and uncertain, like animals who had learned that sudden gestures often preceded violence. Sergeant Michael Nakamura stood near the entrance, his Japanese-American features impassive as he directed them to their seats. He understood, perhaps better than most of the other guards, what it meant to be considered the enemy in your own country. His family had spent 2 years in an internment camp in California while he fought for America in Europe. Emily took a seat near the middle of the room, her hands folded in her lap to stop them from shaking. Beside her, Britta sat rigid and silent, her eyes fixed on the empty plate before her. Charlotte positioned herself at the head of one table, her natural leadership instincts placing her where she could observe and protect the younger women. Annalise and Elizabeth sat together, the youngest and the most visibly frightened, their faces pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The room fell into a heavy silence as Private David Fletcher and 2 other guards began bringing out trays from the kitchen. The young man from Kansas had volunteered for this duty, partly out of curiosity and partly because Captain Thornton had made it clear he wanted guards who could show restraint and basic human decency. David had grown up on a farm where hospitality was considered a fundamental virtue, where you fed anyone who came to your door regardless of who they were or where they came from. The first trays held simple fare: sliced bread, actual white bread made from real wheat flour, butter that was golden and soft, a soup that smelled of vegetables and chicken, rich with fat that floated on its surface in small amber circles. The women stared at the food as if it might be a hallucination, something their starving minds had conjured from desperation. But it was what came next that changed everything. Della Mae Washington emerged from the kitchen carrying a large baking dish, steam rising from its surface. The aroma that preceded her was like nothing the German women had experienced in years. It was sweet and warm, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, rich with the scent of peaches that had been baked until their sugars caramelized into something approaching the divine. She set the dish down on the serving table, her face carefully neutral, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. "That's peach cobbler," Private Fletcher announced to the room, his voice uncertain about whether anyone understood him. It's dessert." He made a gesture of eating, trying to communicate through pantomime what words could not convey across the language barrier. Emily Vogt was the first to understand. She had studied English in school, and though the word cobbler meant nothing to her, she understood dessert. Her entire body began to tremble. Beside her, Britta's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice under pressure. Young Annalise made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Charlotte Bauer's hands shook as she lifted the first spoonful of peach cobbler to her lips. At 28 years old, she had trained herself to maintain control in every situation, to be the steady presence that younger women could rely upon. But control meant nothing in the face of this golden, fragrant impossibility that sat before her. The moment the cobbler touched her tongue, something inside her broke open. The peaches were soft and yielding, their sweetness almost painful after months of bitter deprivation. The pastry dissolved in her mouth, buttery and rich, carrying flavors she had forgotten existed in the world. And underneath it all was warmth, not just the physical heat of fresh baking, but something deeper that tasted like care, like abundance, like the opposite of everything she had known for the past 2 years. She began to cry, not delicate tears that could be hidden or explained away, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place beyond hunger, beyond exhaustion, beyond even relief. Around her, the other women responded in their own ways. Britta ate slowly, methodically, her face a mask even as tears streamed down her cheeks in silent rivers. Elizabeth covered her mouth with both hands, her shoulders shaking. Annalise simply wept openly, making no effort to hide her reaction. Emily took 3 bites before she had to stop, her stomach cramping from the richness, after months of near starvation. But those 3 bites had transported her somewhere else entirely. She remembered her grandmother's kitchen in Munich before the war, remembered Sunday afternoons when the house smelled of baking and the radio played music that wasn't martial or militant. She remembered being a child who believed the world was fundamentally good, that adults could be trusted, that there would always be enough to eat. The cobbler tasted like that lost innocence, and the sweetness of it was almost unbearable. Private David Fletcher stood near the wall, watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort. He had expected the prisoners to be grateful, perhaps even surprised, but this collective breakdown in the face of dessert was something he hadn't prepared himself to witness. These women weren't behaving like enemy soldiers. They were behaving like people who had been broken and were only now beginning to understand the full extent of their own fracturing. Sergeant Nakamura noticed it too. He moved closer to Captain Thornton, who stood observing from the doorway. "Sir," he said quietly, is this?" He trailed off, unable to articulate what exactly was wrong with the scene before them. "Let them be," Thornton said, his voice rough. His own eyes were suspiciously bright. He was thinking of his son, thinking of how the boy had probably gone hungry in those final days before Normandy, thinking of how he would have wanted someone, anyone, to show his son kindness in those last moments. Let them have this. In the kitchen, Della Mae Washington stood with her back against the wall, listening to the sounds of weeping that filtered through the service window. Her hands were still dusted with flour, still carrying the evidence of the care she had put into that cobbler. She had expected to feel satisfaction at following orders. She had expected to feel anger at having to show kindness to the enemy. What she hadn't expected was this strange, uncomfortable sensation in her chest that felt almost like recognition, like looking into a mirror. 3 days had passed since the peach cobbler incident, as the guards had begun calling it among themselves. The German women moved through the camp with a different quality to their movements now, less rigid, less prepared for violence. But it was the meal times that had become truly strange. The women no longer simply ate in silence. They spoke to each other in hushed German, gesturing toward the food with something that looked like wonder, like they were trying to convince each other that what they were experiencing was real. Della Mae had watched them from the kitchen window during each meal, noting how they savored even simple foods like scrambled eggs and toast. She noticed how Emilie Vogt always ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid the food might disappear if she moved too quickly. She noticed how young Annalise divided everything on her plate into exact portions before taking a single bite, a habit born from years of rationing. And she noticed how Charlotte Bauer always ensured the younger women ate before taking anything for herself, the instinct of leadership persisting even in captivity. On the 4th morning, something unexpected happened. Emilie approached the kitchen service window during breakfast cleanup, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She waited until Della Mae noticed her, then spoke in careful, heavily accented English. "Excuse me, Corporal. May I speak with you, please?" Della Mae set down the pot she had been scrubbing and wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the window, maintaining the professional distance that regulations required, but curious despite herself. "What do you need?" Emilie's face flushed with the effort of forming English words. The sweet food. From 3 days before." She gestured helplessly, searching for vocabulary she didn't possess. "The fruit, She paused, frustrated. "In German we say Pfirsich." "Peaches," Della Mae said flatly. "It's called peach cobbler." "Yes, peach cobbler," Emilie repeated, the foreign words awkward in her mouth. "It was." She stopped, and for a moment her carefully composed expression crumbled. "It was the most beautiful thing I have tasted in 2 years." Her eyes filled with tears that she blinked back quickly. "I wanted to say thank you, to the person who made it." The words hung in the air between them, creating a moment that neither woman had been prepared for. Della Mae felt something shift in her chest, something uncomfortable that she wanted to push away but couldn't quite dismiss. This German woman standing before her, this enemy soldier, was thanking her for dessert with tears in her eyes. It was absurd. It was inappropriate. It was also completely genuine. "I made it," Della Mae heard herself say. "It's my grandmother's recipe." Emily's eyes widened. You You made this? She pressed her hand against her heart. Then I thank you. From here. From, she searched for the word, from my soul. Della Mae nodded stiffly, unsure how to respond to such raw emotion. It's just food. It's my job. No, Emily said with sudden intensity, it is not just food. It is, she struggled, it is remembering that good things exist. Lieutenant Catherine Reynolds had established a policy that allowed the prisoners to write letters home once a week. It was part of the Geneva Convention requirements, part of maintaining the illusion that normalcy still existed somewhere in the world. Every Wednesday afternoon, she distributed paper and pencils to any woman who requested them, collected the finished letters, and sent them through military postal channels to the International Red Cross for processing and delivery. What she hadn't anticipated was how many of those letters would come back marked address unknown or undeliverable, destination destroyed. By the third week of September, a box in her office contained 43 letters that had nowhere to go, written to addresses that no longer existed in cities that had been reduced to rubble. Emily Vogt sat in the recreation barracks on a Wednesday afternoon, her pencil hovering over blank paper. She had been trying to write to her mother for an hour, but the words wouldn't come. How could she describe peach cobbler to someone who was likely eating boiled nettles and potato peels? How could she explain that the American enemy was feeding her 3 meals a day plus dessert when her own mother might be starving in occupied Munich? The guilt sat heavy in her stomach, making even the memory of sweetness taste like betrayal. Beside her, Britta was actually writing, her handwriting small and precise as always. She was addressing her letter to her younger sister in Berlin, though she had no idea if her sister was still alive, still in Berlin, or still at the same address. The letter began with practical details about the camp, about the weather in Tennessee, about anything except the one truth that dominated every waking moment. We are being treated better here than we were in our own country at the end. We are eating food that our own government couldn't provide. We are receiving kindness from people we were taught to hate. Young Annalise had given up on writing entirely. She sat with blank paper in front of her, tears falling silently onto the clean white surface and creating small pools that spread and dissolved the possibility of words. Her entire family had lived in Dresden. She had received one letter from the Red Cross confirming what she already knew in her bones. There was no one left to write to. The address she had memorized since childhood, the apartment where she had learned to walk and talk and dream, existed now only in memory and ash. Charlotte Bauer approached Lieutenant Reynolds directly during letter collection that afternoon. In her careful English, she asked the question that all the women had been avoiding. "Lieutenant, how many of our letters have reached their destinations?" Catherine Reynolds looked at the older German woman and made a decision to be honest. "Out of 137 letters submitted," she said quietly, 19 have been confirmed delivered. The rest are either lost in processing or the addresses no longer exist. Charlotte's face remained impassive, but her hands tightened on the letter she was holding. "I see," she said. "And yet you continue to allow us to write them." "Yes," Catherine said. "Because sometimes the writing matters more than the sending. Sometimes you need to say the words even if no one hears them." That evening, Emily finally finished her letter. She wrote about the peach cobbler in detail, describing the taste and texture and warmth of it. She wrote about Corporal Washington and her grandmother's recipe. The camp had settled into an uneasy routine by late September. The German women rose at 6 each morning, attended roll call, worked assigned duties, and ate 3 meals that continued to feel like small miracles. But the abundance that had initially brought tears now brought something more complicated. Guilt that sat heavy as stones in their stomachs, making every bite taste like betrayal. Charlotte Bauer noticed it first among the younger women. Annalise had begun leaving food on her plate, pushing away half-eaten portions with a look of disgust that had nothing to do with the quality of the cooking. When Charlotte asked her about it in German, the girl's response was anguished. "How can I eat this when my family is dead? How can I enjoy anything when they had nothing?" The division within the camp became more pronounced as the weeks passed. Some women, like Elizabeth Koenig, ate everything offered to them with fierce determination. She had decided that survival was its own form of resistance, that refusing to let starvation claim her was the only tribute she could offer to those who hadn't survived. Others, like Britta Schroeder, approached each meal with visible reluctance, eating only enough to maintain basic function, as if deprivation was a penance they owed. Della Mae Washington noticed the changes from her kitchen window. She watched Emily Vogt accept a second helping of fried chicken one evening, then watched the woman's face crumple with something that looked like shame. She saw how some prisoners traded their dessert portions to others, creating a strange economy of guilt and acceptance, and she found herself unexpectedly disturbed by it all. One afternoon, Della Mae did something she hadn't planned. She approached Emily during kitchen cleanup duty, where the German woman had been assigned to help wash dishes. "You stopped eating the cobbler," she said without preamble. "Why?" Emily's hands stilled in the soapy water. Her English had improved considerably over the weeks. "It feels wrong," she said quietly. "To enjoy something so much when others have nothing. My mother, my family, they are," she paused, searching for words. "I do not know if they are alive, but if they are hungry. Real hunger. And I am here eating dessert made by my enemy." The word enemy hung between them like smoke. Della Mae felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, but underneath it was something else, something she didn't want to acknowledge. She thought of her brother Samuel, thought of how she had wanted him to have one good meal before he died, one moment of sweetness before the world took him. She thought of her grandmother making cobbler through every hardship, insisting that survival required both body and spirit to be fed. "Starving yourself doesn't feed them," Della Mae said finally. "It just means more people go hungry." Emily looked up, her blue eyes meeting Della Mae's dark ones. "Then what should I do with this guilt?" "Learn to carry it," Della Mae replied. "And keep living anyway." October brought an unexpected visitor to Fort Campbell. Colonel Theodore Jameson, from the War Department's Prisoner Rehabilitation Division, arrived with a clipboard, a photographer, and instructions to document the camp's operations for a report on enemy prisoner treatment. Captain Thornton had been given only 2 days' notice, barely enough time to ensure everything was in regulation order, but not enough time to change the fundamental nature of what was happening in his camp. The inspection began at morning roll call and continued through the day's activities. Colonel Jameson observed work details, reviewed medical records, and interviewed both guards and prisoners through Lieutenant Reynolds' translation. He was professional, thorough, and gave no indication of what conclusions he was drawing. But it was during the evening meal that something shifted in his carefully neutral expression. The dining hall was filled with its usual sounds. Quiet conversations in mixed German and English, the clink of utensils against plates, the occasional laugh from Private Fletcher telling one of his farm stories that transcended language barriers. The German women no longer sat segregated at separate tables, but were interspersed throughout the room, sharing space with guards who had stopped thinking of them as prisoners and started thinking of them as people. Della Mae had prepared her grandmother's peach cobbler again, this time using the last of the season's peaches that Mrs. Patterson had brought from her orchard. When Private Fletcher brought out the steaming dish, the response from the German women was immediate and visible. Emily smiled, genuinely smiled. For perhaps the first time since her capture, Britta closed her eyes as the aroma reached her, her rigid posture softening. Even Charlotte, always controlled, allowed herself a moment of undisguised anticipation. Colonel Jameson watched this interaction with growing interest. He turned to Captain Thornton, who stood beside him. "That's quite a reaction to dessert," he observed quietly. "Corporal Washington makes it from her grandmother's recipe," Thornton explained. "It was the first meal we served them that made them realize we weren't going to treat them as they expected." He paused, then added, "It changed something in them, sir. Broke through whatever walls they had built to survive." The colonel said nothing, but he pulled out a small notebook and began writing. Over the next hour, he interviewed Della Mae about her cooking, spoke with several prisoners about their treatment, and took extensive notes on what he termed the psychological impact of dignified care on enemy rehabilitation. 3 weeks later, Captain Thornton received an official memorandum from Washington. The Fort Campbell model, as it was now being called, was to be implemented across all remaining prisoner of war camps. The memo specifically mentioned the importance of food that conveyed respect and abundance, citing the peach cobbler incident as evidence that small acts of humanity could accelerate the transformation of enemy soldiers into potential peacetime citizens. Della Mae Washington's grandmother's recipe had become official military policy. Sweetness, it seemed, was now a weapon of peace. 23 years later, on a warm September afternoon in 1968, Della Mae Washington stood in her small kitchen in Savannah, Georgia, preparing peach cobbler from her grandmother's recipe. She was 55 years old now, retired from the Army with full honors, living in the house where she had been raised. Her hands moved through the familiar motions with the ease of decades of practice, cutting butter into flour, slicing peaches with precision, measuring cinnamon by feel rather than spoons. The doorbell rang at precisely 2 o'clock, as the letter had promised it would. Della Mae wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front door, her heart beating with a rhythm she couldn't quite name. When she opened the door, 3 women stood on her porch, their faces lined with age but still recognizable after more than 2 decades. Emily Vogt Henderson stood in the center, her blonde hair now streaked with gray, her English flawless and unaccented. Beside her was Britta Schroeder Williams, who had married an American engineer and settled in Ohio. And next to them stood young Annalise, no longer young at 42, who had become a nurse in Boston and carried with her the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to carry grief without being destroyed by it. "Corporal Washington," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion, "we came to say thank you." The women embraced on that porch in Georgia, former enemies who had been transformed by something as simple as dessert and as complex as the choice to see humanity in each other. They came inside, and Della Mae served them peach cobbler made from the same recipe that had changed their lives 23 years earlier. Over cobbler and coffee, the women shared their stories. Emilie had found her mother alive in Munich and had brought her to America in 1950. She had 2 daughters now, both of whom she had taught to make peach cobbler. Britta had become a translator for the State Department, using her unique perspective to bridge cultural divides. Annalise had dedicated her life to refugee medicine, helping displaced persons find healing in foreign lands. But they had come for more than reunion. They had come with a proposal. They wanted to compile a cookbook, a collection of recipes that told stories of reconciliation. German recipes from their grandmothers, alongside American recipes from the women who had shown them kindness. Della Mae's peach cobbler would be the first entry, accompanied by the story of how dessert had broken through hatred. As the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, 4 women who had once been separated by war sat together planning a future built on the radical notion that food could heal what violence had broken. Della Mae's grandmother had been right all along. There was nothing in this world that couldn't be made a little better with something sweet. Sometimes that sweetness was peach cobbler. Sometimes it was forgiveness. Often, it was both.